Donald McPherson. I was born and raised near Adams, Nebraska on a farm. I went to school at a one-room country school called Grandview. I think it was about when I was in the 11th grade why I saw this attractive young lady at school. She was a year behind me, and I decided to think maybe I'd like to know her a little bit better. And so my one older sister was teaching school, and she let me use the car, and so I was kind of driving around a little bit and trying to decide what I wanted to do. And I happened to think about this young lady, and her name is Thelma Johnston, and her folks lived right at the south edge of Adams. So I decided, well, I'm going to go out there and see if she's home, and maybe we'll go riding or something. And so when I went to the door, why, she came to the door, and I asked her if she'd like to go for a ride, and she said, I sure would, she said. And so that was our first date and the start of something that turned out to be a marriage quite a few years later. And I had already decided that I wasn't going to going to let the draft take me, and decide which branch of the service that I would get into after the war had started. And I decided on the Navy because I already had an older brother that was in the Navy, and so that was a no-brainer. I knew exactly what I was going to do with that. Well, when I talked to my folks, they were a little concerned. They thought, at that time, I think most people thought that flying was a really dangerous occupation, and so it ended up then we were visiting about it one evening, and I said to my mother, she had said, well, it's hard for me to decide on you going, into the flying business because of the danger of it, she said. And I told her, I said, well, I'm going to serve my country, and I've decided I'd rather do it from the seat of an airplane than from a foxhole. And so I joined the V5 program, and that would have been in September of 1942, I think. And that was to be an 18-month program. And during that program, they moved you every 3 months. Well, my first one was Mount Vernon, Iowa. They'd taken over part of a little Cornell college. And so we were there for 3 months, and we really didn't do any flying there. It was all physical conditioning and studying. And at the end of 3 months, then while we were transported to various different places, but the group that they always handle you alphabetically with how your name fell in the alphabetical order, and so we ended up then, the group I was in, we were scheduled for Grand Junction, Colorado. Then we first started flying, and we usually would have an instructor through the 3-month period. We started with the steerman. We learned all of our aerobatics in the steerman, and then we started flying what they called, it was a Vultee. The nickname for the students was the Vultee vibrator, so it had a little bit of a vibration to it, when used. But that was a little larger plane, a little more horsepower, and it still had a fixed landing gear though. So that's the plane that we finished up with Ormond, Oklahoma, and then we sent to Corpus Christi, Texas, and that's the first actual Navy base that we had been at that time. At Texas then, we pretty much went through all of the fighter tactics. We learned, to fly in the back seat with the hood over, so you couldn't see, and you had to fly strictly by your instruments. And we learned to home in on radio beams to airports and things like that. Well, the 3 months we were there, we were pretty much practicing fighter tactics and things like that, and when we got done, there were 6 of us then picked to go to the Great Lakes to check out and carrier landings. They had 2 old luxury liners. One of them had been a paddle wheel ship, and so they took us out one day by boat and onto this old paddle wheeler, and we were to observe others, doing their landings, so we could see exactly how they're supposed to be done. And this old thing was so slow that they had to have about 25 knots breeze over the deck, in order to slow the planes down enough to land. Well, we were watching them, and this old skipper of that ship, he was a pistol. He had a bullhorn, and every time somebody made kind of a rough landing, he was hollering at them, but, over this loudspeaker thing. And finally, this one guy did his 3rd landing, and it was pretty rough too. And he was down off the deck and up on the wing of that plane, and he was pounding that pilot on the shoulder with his fist, and he was really telling him off, And I was sitting there thinking, man, I hope I don't draw this one tomorrow. And I did, though. But we circled for an hour, and the wind never did come up enough that we could land, and so they sent us back. And then the next day, then we landed on the other one because it was a little faster, and I got my 8 landings in then. And I had my orders then cut for San Diego, so I knew that was going to be overseas, and so.
To be an ace fighter pilot, you have to have at least 5 aerial combat kills. And throughout the course of the Second World War, 1,300 pilots became ace fighter pilots. And out of those, 381 of them were Navy ace fighter pilots. And if you were a Pacific War veteran, you probably passed through right here. It's right there at the USS Arizona where the war all began, and back there at the USS Missouri where it all ended. It was here on December 7th, 1941, where the Japanese attacked the United States, inflicting 2,400 American deaths, and they damaged 19 different ships, 8 of which were battleships. In the interview, Mr. McPherson, he was here during training, and he said he could see the USS Arizona out his bunk window, just a couple little antennas sticking out. Mr. Don McPherson, he flew a Hellcat during World War II. The Hellcat was arguably one of the best aircraft carrier-based planes the United States had. We came out with over 12,000 of them during the war. They accounted for 5,000 different enemy confirmed kills and had a 19-to-1 kill ratio. So considering that they didn't even come into the war until like a year and a half late, they didn't enter the war until about 1943, they racked up a really amazing resume. And it's the Hellcat that Mr. Don McPherson flew during his time in the Pacific Theater in Okinawa.
When we finally got there and rounded the Diamond Head, heading into Pearl Harbor, so then when we got into the channel, wow, it was just like a junkyard. They had all these blown up ships, they had dredged those and piled them along each side, and still rusty metal everywhere. And it really brought back to, how terrible that attack really was. And we stayed in Ford Island, that's the west side of Pearl. And I could look out my bunk room window and I could see that battleship that they made the shrine out of. I see it sitting on the bottom with just a couple of antennas sticking up out of the water.
The Arizona?
So, yeah, the Arizona. I was only there about, just a little over 2 months, and this Air Group 83 had formed on the West Coast as a complete unit, and Air Group 83 had had a pilot get killed in carrier landings, and so they needed a replacement. Somehow, I don't know how they do that, but somehow my name come up, so they flew me over there about 3:30 in the afternoon. When I got over there, I had quite a shock because they were all packed ready to go to combat the next day. So I didn't get a chance to fly with any of the guys, didn't get to know them even. They put us on a Australian troop ship. That took us to Ulithi Harbor, which is in the Carolina Islands. And that's where we went aboard the Essex aircraft carrier. And the night that we got aboard, we got aboard during the day, and then got kind of settled a little bit. And at chow time, why they told us in the evening that after we ate, why they were going to show a movie on the hangar deck, and so we thought that, well, that'd be a good time, a good thing to spend the evening, So we went down and watched that movie and got about halfway through it, and general quarters sounded. And of course, the sailors and the ship's officers, they took off on a run, knocking down chairs and a little bit of everything to get to their units, A lot of them were manning the guns and things like that. And here we stand looking at each other. We had no idea what we were supposed to do at that point. And they finally announced then that we were to go to the officers' mess hall. We didn't know exactly where it was, but somebody finally led us there, and so we spent the time there until the raid was over. Well, what had happened was we found out right away what the Kamikaze Suicide Corps was about. The Japanese, toward the end of the war, now they had formed this Kamikaze Corps, which was actually a suicide corps. They trained the pilots to dive their planes into ships or other targets, and they were so desperate that time, why, they were willing to give up their lives, I guess, in order to do a lot of damage. And so that's what had happened. The one targeted our Essex, but he overshot, and then he clipped the radar mast off the top of the ship and then crashed on the island next to us. And then the other one did a bouncing blow on the carrier that was anchored next to us. But I don't think it did a terrible lot of damage because they left for combat with us the next day. And when we got there, it was a surprise. We had no idea we had the battleships and cruisers and carriers and stuff that we had at that point, after Pearl Harbor. But boy, there was ships anchored as far as you could see, and so we left the next day, and when we left, I was still an extra pilot. But all of our planes, they divided us in divisions of 4. And we each had call signs, and so this Wonder 5 division, they had to take off one morning in the dark. It had rained during the night, and the deck was wet. And their second guy in the division let his Hellcat get away from him, and he skidded off the side of the carrier into the ocean. And sometimes they don't survive those. Sometimes they get sucked into the screws, that way. But he got out of it, and they picked him up, and the next time he flew, he did the same thing, but he survived that one also. So they decided, well, he just wasn't fit for combat, and so I took his place and I joined Wonder 5 Division and Flying Wing on the division leader. My first flight then was a sortie where we got up, took off in the dark, and we flew 300 miles to Nitagahara Airfield on Kyushu. And that was about somewhere in the neighborhood to the 16th of March of 1945. And so when we got there, we got them out of bed, which we hoped, that's what we hoped to do. And we could see them running to their planes or running to their air guns and so forth. And so we got in. We usually made our attacks in a steep dive so that we get close to 400 knots in the dive, and then when you pull it out normally, they'd shoot behind you. They'd hardly ever lead you enough. So I picked out a twin-engine bomber that they called a Betty. They gave us nicknames for all the Japanese planes, so we didn't have to remember those Japanese names. And so I picked this Betty out. It was sitting there on the tarmac, and we were carrying rockets, and we were also carrying belly tanks, because flying 300 miles and back, we really needed an auxiliary tank. And so I fired my rockets at this Betty and strafed then too, and I stayed in my dive until it blew up. Then I was getting low enough, I had to pull out pretty fast. And when I pulled out, my engine quit. And of course, the smoke from the stalled engine started coming in the cockpit, so I rolled the hatch open to get some fresh air. Within the suction, pulled my goggles and my helmet off my head, which had my radio phones in it. Everything went flying off into space. Well, I had lost enough speed by that time. I could see tracer bullets crossing in front of me. They were leading him too much. Well, and then that 2,000 horsepower engine took over. Now that surge pulled me back into those. So I went home that day with some holes in my airplane. But by that time we had made our run toward the ocean, and so I was kind of getting out of harm's way. And well, on the way back, the Hellcat didn't just fly quite right, but I kind of had to fight it a little more than normal. But by using trim tabs and so forth, I got it so it would almost fly hands off for a period of time, But when I went back and landed, and it landed fine. My plane captain, they always crawl up on the wing, help you unbuckle, and ask you some questions of what you saw and so forth. And when he crawled up, he said, "I see you picked up a little lead today." And I said, "Well, yeah, whereabouts?" He said, "Well, there's a hole about a foot behind your back," he said. But what had made the plane not fly quite right, it shot the cable into the vertical stabilizer in the tail. So I didn't have any control over that, but it wasn't all that serious. So at this point then, the fleet was being harassed terribly by kamikazes. There was about a week that our ship's gunners just almost ate and slept with their gun mounts, because there was a bogey on the radar screen, almost continually. And so there was this one fairly small island called Kikijima that had an airport, and they decided maybe some of those kamikazes were stationed there, and so they sent the four of us there to check that out. And when we got there, there were no airborne aircraft. Apparently, they were out on attack somewhere. And so we really messed up the place. We damaged a lot of their buildings, and even tore up their landing strip some, with their rockets and stuff, so it'd be hard for them to use. Well, then it's about time we decided that we better get back, so we didn't run out of fuel. And so we started back, and we just got started, and we probably weren't over maybe 1,800 feet off the ocean. And all of a sudden, I spotted two Japanese Val dive bombers on a converging course, coming at us, only they were low on the water. Well, it was a good thing I hadn't put my guns back on safety, because all I had time to do was just shove the nose down and put my sight on the path of that first plane, and squeezed the trigger, and I saw the pilot slump forward in the cockpit, and they plunged into the ocean. But then I wondered what happened to the other one, and I thought maybe the other guys took care of it. Well, I made a wing over, and it was flying toward this airfield we had just attacked. And so I was kind of wondering, quickly, what were the other guys doing, But so I jumped on with full throttle, and I started catching up, and just ready to squeeze the trigger, and I heard my division leader hollering at me over the radio. He said, "Don, get out of there, they're shooting at you from the shore batteries." But I continued to squeeze the trigger, and that one blew up. And so then I did a real violent maneuvering to get out of there so I didn't get shot down. Well, I found out when I got back to the ship, there were more planes that I didn't see. There were two more dive bombers in that group off to the side where I didn't see them when I peeled off on the first one. And those guys were shooting those down. The division leader shot down one of the valves, and section leader got one, and then the last guy in division, which everybody called Tail End Charlie, that was the nickname they gave, he found a Lily, which I found out was a twin-engine scout plane, and he shot that one down. So each of us accounted for our first kills that time. Then it came time then for the invasion of Okinawa, and that happened on April the 1st, which was, that was Easter Sunday.
The Battle of Okinawa was fought between April 1st, 1945 and June 22nd, 1945. It was the last major battle of World War II. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific Theater, and it was the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific Theater. In the Battle of Okinawa, the Japanese military took somewhere between 110,000 and 140,000 people killed. The Okinawa civilians took somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 people killed. The U.S. military took nearly 50,000 casualties, 12,500 of which were people killed in action. It was here in the Battle of Okinawa where the Japanese flew over 1,900 kamikaze missions, and they damaged hundreds of U.S. ships, and they inflicted nearly 5,000 U.S. Navy deaths in an attempt to push the U.S. Navy back.
This happened to be on Easter Sunday, and we fighter pilots, most of us were carrying napalm bombs that morning to scorch the beach. And while the invasion fleet was tremendous, there were ships banging around, on the shore, and they even had a rocket launcher setting out there lobbing rockets onto the beach, so forth, and we'd scorch the beach ahead of the landing craft coming in, and it turned out I don't think there was a terrible lot of loss on that initial landing, because I think evidently the Japanese had either guessed right or they'd got some information, you know, to inform them kind of when the invasion was going to be, because they had pulled back into the hills and mountains and so forth, and boy, then it was different. I mean, the loss of personnel really started to mount. So we continued to hit targets there on Okinawa. Our camera crews found a seaplane base, it's a little seaplane base where they had individual submarines, that just one-man submarines, and they were kamikaze type things. If they could get close enough, why, they just drive that little old sub into a ship, you know, and try to blow it up that way. So we blew that place up, bombed it, and destroyed it. And then a little later, we started doing something that we'd never been trained to do before. They decided that, I guess the Air Force had moved into that first airfield. In the invasion morning, they thought that it would take like 6 days to take the nearest airfield. They had it in 6 hours because of how they had pulled back, you know. And so when the Air Force finally was able to move in there, why, I guess they were so busy that they decided they needed some help, and so they had some of our dive bombers land at that airfield, and they instructed them on close air support for troops. And like I say, we had never been trained for that, but they tried it, and it worked out pretty well. And so then they started having us fighter pilots do it too. Like if the Marines or the infantry had some Japanese bottled up in some of those mountains and caves and tombs and stuff, and had them surrounded, but the only way they'd get to them was with flamethrowers. Why, then they'd ask us to come and fire rockets in there and help them out that way. And that was probably the toughest duty that we drew, because a lot of times you come over one peak, you know, and then dive and shoot your rockets and then pull up before you hit the next mountaintop, you know. So it was kind of tough because, you know, you didn't have any room for error. At one point, they said that we helped I don't know whether it's the Marines or the infantry, but we dropped bombs within 150 yards of our troops. So it was really close quarter stuff. And at one time I went over and reported in, and this pilot, he said, say, he says, I got a grass hut down here I don't like the looks of. He said, put a little ammunition into that. Well, we strafed it, and it was an ammunition dump, and boy, talk about 4th of July. It's just exploding all over the place. Another time, why he had a haystack he didn't like, and so we put rockets into that. Well, that was a fuel dump, you know, for aviation fuel and stuff, you know. So those were kind of fun, because those are about the only time you didn't have somebody shooting at you with any aircraft fire, you know. So hopefully, we helped save some lives, you know, by they had stationed a number of destroyer ships north of Okinawa, between Okinawa and Kyushu. That's the southernmost big island of the Japanese three large islands. And their duty was to be radar pickets. They used their radar to pick up Japanese planes coming in, so that our fighters, you know, could intercept them. Well, that one particular morning, that was probably, I can't remember, either 2 or 3 weeks after the invasion, why they sent Wonder 5 and all of the fighter planes from the Essex and some from one as a carrier, and I never did know what as a carrier that was. But anyway, they sent us over there to fly combat air patrol to protect those destroyers. Well, when you got over there, gosh, the attack had already started, and they know now there was at least 360 kamikazes coming in that flight, trying to take Okinawa back. And so the reason we spotted two of them headed toward one of the destroyers, and so we were, I suppose, probably 1,500 feet off the water, but these old, they were float planes that were flying low of the water, and they were heading toward these destroyers, So we dived on them, of course, not realizing how slow they were. We overshot the first one. Neither one of us got a shot at it, but I shot down the second one. And then the division leader got on the radio and he said, "Hey guys, split up and fight individually and get all these rascals you can." And so that's what we started doing. And I got two more. That with the two I had before made me an ace. The division leader had one before, so he got 3. He missed ace by 1. The division leader had one before, and he got 4, so he made ace. And the last guy in the division was there were 2 levels of these coming in. He got into that upper level where he had a lot more room to maneuver, and he got 6 that day, so he ended up with 7 and qualified for what they call ace a day. In other words, you got more than 5 kills in one day. So the 4 of us then for the war, then we ended up with 21 kills. But those float planes were a problem because they were so slow and then low on the water. We were putting our wheels down, our flaps down, and everything else to slow down enough, that we could maneuver enough to get behind them or in them. So then we ended up then started working on the Japanese home islands. We had been doing that some before. Like if we took off in the dark in the morning, then the time they cruised all day, and then all night, well then the next day, we would be like within 300 miles or 250 miles of Tokyo and the northernmost islands. So we were skipping back and forth, and we had, what was her name? Tokyo Rose.
Right.
You've heard of her. We had her confused because she thought we had 2 task forces because, we were here and then we were there, But finally they figured it out. There was one task force, but we were hustling back and forth, to confuse them. So we ended up then doing a lot of more work on Okinawa. Also, after that, shooting down a lot of those 360 planes, the chances of seeing airborne Japanese aircraft was quite diminished. A lot of our work then was just still a lot of times you'd hit an airfield and maybe 2 or 3 weeks later they'd be rebuilding it, so we go back and tear it up again, and their factories and like trains. Finally we were working the Honshu, which is the one that Tokyo is on. We'd done a lot of work on that, and then we got far enough north, we started hitting the North Island of Okinawa. If I remember it, I think that's the biggest of the 3. But anyway, they found out they knew that they had rail ferries that were carrying supplies back and forth, from Honshu to Hokkaido. And so we attacked those one day. They had 6 of them, and we sank 4 of them. and damaged the fifth one, but they got it beached so it didn't sink. We hit mostly on the northern islands and going back to Tokyo on the mid-island and so forth. But after, at one point that, and I don't remember the date on that, but we got to see the first atomic bomb dropped. Our ship the fleet was told they were intending to go into that area that day, and they notified not to go there, but they weren't told why. And so we had been on a strike, I think, on Honshu that day. And we got back, and I just got up to my bunk room, and they announced over the loudspeakers, they said, if you look to the west, you see a mushroom cloud, and the United States had dropped the first atomic bomb. We didn't even know there was such thing as an atomic bomb. We weren't close enough to see the second one. Got to the end then, why they started, we kind of heard that they were thinking about talking peace, and so then one day we were heading toward this airfield in west of Tokyo that we'd hit several times, and we just got over land around Tokyo, and we got a notice on the radio to get back over the ocean and jettison our bombs or rockets, get rid of our ammunition, that the ceasefire had been called. So we did what they told us to. Then we split up and was doing crazy acrobatics and stuff, to celebrate. Wonder we didn't run into each other. And but we flew quite a bit then the next 2 weeks. They weren't supposed to fly anything. I think I know of two Japanese planes that were shot down during that period. One of them was one of our pilots, one of our lieutenants, shot down one that wasn't supposed to be up there. And then we thought that probably he shot down the last one of the war, but then later on, years later, we found out that the pilot from one of the other carriers shot one down about the same time. So I don't know whether they ever got that one settled or not, but it wasn't really that important. But so then we would just combat air patrol over those islands, and so that they didn't fly anything. And then they informed us then of a twin-engine plane that was going to be painted white and with special markings that was going to fly to Okinawa, fly the Japanese emissaries there to talk ceasefire, the surrender terms. And then our last flight from the Essex, as far as I know, was the day before the signing of the armistice. We flew combat for MacArthur's landing troops at Atsugi Air Base, which is west of Tokyo. And then the next day, there was a lot of the planes that flew cover for the signing of the armistice aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. But I think the reason we didn't fly that day, not just because we'd flied the day before, but we were loading passengers aboard the Essex to leave for home the next day. So when we got home, then got back to the States, so I had decided that this is a tough decision, because I really wanted to make the Navy Air Corps, a career. But there were 26 of us ensigns in our air group, and it had been almost a year, and we still hadn't advanced to lieutenant junior grade. And so now the war's over, and all these guys, what do you have to look forward to? And so I tried to find out from some of the older officers, what they thought would happen. They had no idea either, And so I knew what it could happen. Yeah, Okinawa was really a tough deal. I mean, I've I've read the numbers that were killed on both sides, and it's tremendous. And I think I've read where it was probably of the whole Pacific, all those islands, that it was the worst one as far as. Well, then think what would have been if we'd had to invade Japan proper.
Shortly after World War II, they decommissioned the USS Essex. But then in the 1950s and the 1960s, they recommissioned it. And then finally in 1969, they decommissioned it. And it was finally scrapped in 1973. Don McPherson, he originally came home to farm with his dad until he eventually got a job at the post office working as a postman. He raised his entire family around Adams, Nebraska. He's a lifelong resident of Adams, Nebraska, and he's also a lifelong pillar of the community. And he's always treated people as if they were the hero and he was just the regular guy. I remember running into him one time in high school at the gas station, and he knew everything about me. He knew what grade I was in and what sports I was out for. And as of December 2022, there's only 14 ace fighter pilots left in all of America. That's 14 out of 1,447 total, and 1,300 of them were World War II veterans, and only 14 of them are left. So, these men aren't going to be around forever, but obviously the legacy that they have left will be around forever. And I'd like to leave you with the story that Mr. McPherson told us. It was of a damaged aircraft carrier. The aircraft carrier was sitting kind of at a 45-degree angle, and they dropped him and another pilot off so they could fly out these undamaged Hellcat planes.
So it must have been the Bunker Hill, because they were with us and they took about the same type of a hit. I mean, the back half the ship was really damaged. I mean, I know they had close to 300 killed. And so they landed me aboard. Why, the front part of the ship was untouched. The front elevator where they can take planes up and down to the hangar deck was still intact, so they could use these. So these 3 Hellcat fighters that were in good condition were down the hangar deck, and so they took us down there to get those. And there was cots with dead sailors covered in blankets all over the place. They hadn't had a chance to do any burial at sea, and everything. It was terrible. And the back half of the hangar deck was just destroyed. It had. I even met one of the pilots that was aboard that ship, and he's lucky to be here because they were caught below decks, and of course the burning coal, fuel and everything. Fumes and everything. He said he was climbing over dead sailors to get to one of the ladders up to the flight deck. We didn't have deck enough to make a running takeoff, so they but the catapult worked on the fore end of the flight deck, and so they launched us by catapult. And they would have had to anyway, because that deck was, listing so badly that it would have been next to impossible to make a running takeoff.